Hey there, this is David Angel, and this is sort of a pilot to an idea I've been playing around with for a while called the Opportune Conflict, where I take a little nugget of theory, something that might be a bit abstract and maybe ephemeral, and try and bring it down to a more concrete and relatable level with the idea that we take something that I find interesting in theory of conflict resolution or decision making and really talk about how it applies to our daily lives and how to really start using that as a springboard for making better decisions or resolving conflicts that we might have ongoing. Anyhow, anything I reference, I'll try and go ahead and make links to in the descriptions. And today's topic I wanted to explore is the idea about the difference between being a competitive negotiator and a problem solving negotiator. Now, you may have heard these terms before, and most people generally don't view them in a neutral light. People tend to either like one or the other. Being competitive sounds for some like it's a strong position to be coming from, while others might view it as being a jerk. And problem solving for some might view as a healthy way of resolving our conflicts, taking other people's values into consideration, while others might view it as a weak negotiating position to enter into, serious talks about. What I'm going to be really exploring, though, is this idea that at the outset, being competitive or problem solving on their own doesn't really have a sense of good or bad. It's really how we experience it, how it's utilized, and the outcomes they produce. And so I want to start first with the definition of problem solving and competitive as I understand it relating to decision making, conflict resolution, negotiations, etc. And competitive, that is really being someone that is looking out for your own interests first and foremost. While problem solving tends to be taking your own interests, but also the interest of other parties involved into consideration. And so you can sort of see how some people might view being competitive as being a jerk because you're not thinking about someone else's needs, and why some might view problem solving as being weak because you might be giving too much away. I'm going to sort of gloss over that for the moment and just sort of dig down into a little bit of the pros and cons of each of them and just sort of highlight why being one or the other could be useful in some situations and some outcomes while not in others. So as you think about being competitive, normally the image that might come to mind is a group of people in a executive room negotiating over high stakes, counter offers being made, concessions being made, control of information being highly desired, as well as power over leverage, things like that. Being a very hard, stonewalled negotiator to extract what you want. Typically, when competitive negotiators get together, they're splitting the pie is sort of the analogy that is used, whereas problem solving is generally about growing the pie. And so problem solvers get together and they may take a little bit longer, but they're talking about what the interests might be. They're exploring new options with the idea that by being vested in exploring what each other wants, really, you come and create solutions that may not have been possible otherwise, thereby expanding the pie that is available. Now, those both sound interesting at first blush, but sometimes depending on the circumstances, there are times you might want to be engaged in a competitive style of negotiating as opposed to problem solving and vice versa. For example, you may come into a situation where you enter in both parties competitive. The pie actually might just be larger to start with and so easier to split. There might not be a lot of room for growth there. And that's a counterpoint to the problem solving, expanding the pie idea, which could end up potentially taking too long and or not being productive and not resulting in an outcome quickly enough. So when I think about whether or not to be competitive versus problem solving, I always try to remember, though, that there is a difference between intent versus behavior and the outcomes that are involved. And what I mean by that is you can enter into a negotiation wanting to behave in a certain way, either being competitive or being problem solving, but you can use the tactics and styles of behavior of that alternate method as well. So, for example, you could come into a negotiation thinking first and foremost about your own needs, but you could play ball and be a problem solving negotiator as well. Or you could pretend to be one and be like the wolf in sheep's clothing, in which case you take advantage of the problem solving's openness on a variety of topics. And that's really why there is a big contrast between being problem solving and competitive is because problem solving, the tactics and styles used within that negotiation tend to be weak against competitive tactics that are used. I wouldn't say they're exact polar opposites, but in competitive, you want to control information, you want to have power and leverage over concessions, while in problem solving, you may actually be openly exchanging information and either not using the power that you have or avoiding the use of the power that you have in order to get a more collaborative outcome at the end. Okay, so that's a lot of the technical stuff. I'm going to get a little bit more into the real world application of when you might want to choose one or the other. So like I was saying, the intent with which you are wanting out of a negotiation should be driving your behavior. And so depending on the circumstances of the situation you might be in, you'll want to look at which of these styles of negotiation may have the better chance for a good outcome. So for example, if you're going to a car dealership and you normally like to be problem solving, you may want to consider whether or not it would be better to adopt a competitive stance during that negotiation itself. Or if you tend to be very competitive, but you're working within an organization that tends to frown on the hard use of power and openly values collaboration with teammates, you may be perceived as either jerkish or off-putting, just by trying to potentially be bullheaded into a situation that may require more delicateness or tact. So those are some areas where it's important to derive between interests, intent, versus behavior, versus outcome, and things like that. Another thing I want to bring up, though, is the idea that you really are keeping an eye out for the outcome itself. And that just because you're being competitive doesn't mean you don't have the problem-solving mentality at heart. A good example might be a parent with their children for dinner time. You might give them 3 different choices of vegetables to eat, but they don't really have a choice of eating a vegetable. They just have the choice of which one do they eat. You're not really having a long, in-depth discussion with your child necessarily at that moment about all the various details, reminding them about the nutritional health and value of eating your vegetables. It may be a very short conversation in that regard. Yeah, that's a bit of a competitive stance to take, but given the fact you're looking out for someone else's well-being in this situation, it's very much problem-solving at heart. And then, of course, we look back at that competitive angle. If you're being selfish in a negotiation, but you realize being selfish in that negotiation is not a good tactic to be using, you can play ball with problem solvers. You may get somewhat impatient at how much time it might take, but in the end, you might get exactly what you're wanting to get out of that situation as well. And so that's all talking about negotiation, but a lot of times negotiation really is a life skill that is constantly surrounding us. It is always present. It's just not always formally defined as being what we think of as negotiation. And so whenever you're in a situation where you're trying to come up with a solution to a problem or resolve a conflict that's ongoing, if you can keep in mind how are others and yourself behaving in this moment, then you can affect positive change to increase the likelihood of a good outcome for you and others involved. And so when you have a situation where, it's ideally nice to have a competitor versus a competitor, because if they both play that game well, you can actually get fairly good outcomes out of those kinds of negotiations. And the same can be said with problem solvers working with problem solvers. You can get very good outcomes that expand the pie and grow more opportunities by having worked together. And sometimes, when you have a mismatch of behavioral styles of negotiation or just the way you approach life, that can be where a lot of conflict can be caused. And you might think, it's always great if you're going to have to be the competitor because then you can take advantage of all the other problem solvers. It's just the caveat is it only really works with the idea of everyone getting some value from the situation. If you're always hard-nosed and you're always being the competitive person, you can engender ill will. And typically when people get to see someone they view as haughty or disliked have their own little downfall, a little bit of schadenfreude comes into play, and they're less likely to help you. The same can be said about being a good problem solver. You may build a lot of bridges. You may not get a lot in the immediate moment, but by having engendered the goodwill by, in your mind and maybe others as well, applying a value judgment of saying it's a good idea to be a problem solver and collaborative, you can then pull upon future goodwill from other people to potentially help yourself out in times of difficulty. But again, I have to give the caveat that a lot of this is also dependent on the sociocultural norms within which you are operating. If you go into a company that is known for not caring and are very hard on their employees, coming in and trying to be problem solving may be perceived as a weakness, not respected, or just you beating your head against a wall all the time. And I already mentioned, if you really like being direct and competitive, while that might work in that hard-nosed environment, if you come into an organization that others may perceive as softer or more focused on soft skills or being collaborative or taking time to make decisions in a joint method, then yeah, you're going to have a similar but converse experience to that other situation where you're going to be viewed in an ill light potentially. And so when you think about the cultural norms within which you're operating, you do have some options. The first one being you can learn and become better at the style of negotiation, the behavior that is more respected, appreciated, and or effective within that culture. You can work and improve on those skills without sacrificing your own goals, your own moral values. A good example is William Ury looking at Getting a Yes is a book that really does explore, if you want to be a problem solver, how do you help people that are being competitive come across to become problem solvers themselves, or at least blunt the impact of their competitive stance so that you can still affect some of the positive problem solving outcomes that is commonly associated with being problem solving in the first place. Another good book that comes to mind is like Martin Latz's Gain the Edge. And that's a good one because it sort of explores when to be either competitive or when to be problem solving based on a couple good short metrics that you can keep an eye out for. And so it's always worthwhile thinking, not just am I doing a good job, but can I do a good job in a different way, especially if you find yourself frustrated and without change coming along. And this is a good area to sort of point out that how we behave in a negotiation or how we behave in everyday life is a lot of the times based on the forethought we put into potential situations before they happen. Otherwise we find ourselves reacting. And sometimes, when you see a snake on the ground and you jump back, that's great, because if it was rattling its tail and was about to bite you because you were too close, that automatic response was spot on. But if you end up lashing out in your garden and you kill the snake, the garden snake that was only keeping the mice and rats at bay, well, you might be looking at a little bit of a worst harvest and or infestation problem on your property. And so that's why it's a good idea to think about, what does it mean to be competitive? What does it mean to be problem solving? And how am I behaving in this exact moment? Is this the best way to be behaving? Can I change things up to affect a better outcome? And so if you think about it, and I think this is where it becomes the abstract sort of, David, what are you really talking about here? You've given me so many little examples, but nothing that I can really stand my feet on to digest. The real takeaway I have is to think about, in those situations, reflecting maybe afterwards, but if you can catch yourself in the moment where something isn't going well and think, do I need to change my approach? That's really going to be a first step to being able to apply some of the problem solving or competitive tactics in that moment. Because if you don't realize how you're behaving, or if it's not doing a good job, or if you don't realize why it's doing a good job, you can't really improve upon those outcomes either. And a lot of the problems and stresses that comes along through conflict, they don't tend to be situations that are easy to sort of, let me take a step back, go up to my mental balcony and perceive myself from a good 30 feet away type of a moment. They tend to be heavy with emotions. They tend to be very laden with things that come at you fast and heavy. And so the more we can think about these ideas in advance, the more we can really apply them in those moments. And you'll notice it every once in a while if you have that moment where you're just like, hold on a second, this is not, I need to change something up. What was that What was that thing I was thinking of that could really make a difference? What can I try differently here that I've been thinking about? Anyhow, this little talk wasn't supposed to be about getting into the nitty gritty details of how to execute on being a good competitor or a good problem solver. The real goal I just wanted to have was just introducing the idea of what does it mean to be competitive versus problem solving in our general lives. And that if we can start thinking about when and or if we are behaving in those ways, that opens the door later on to some of the more advanced techniques that we can learn and apply, whether or not it's in our general lives, in our relationships with our family members, or at work. That's really where a lot of the more advanced details come in. And so, yeah, I'm going to end on that note. Just the idea that we take things to start with small little bite-sized nuggets that we can start digesting. And so go ahead and think this over for a bit. And if it seems like it resonates with you, then you can explore the further details about how to exactly become better at negotiations or at those other various life skills that tends to, become automatic responses over time, but sometimes take very conscious foresight in the beginning to break out of certain behavioral patterns we might have gotten ourselves into ruts for. Anyhow, that was my prototype for the first of my Opportune Conflict series, with the goal of taking little ideas that I find interesting and trying to just see if I can make them just a little bit more relatable and or thought-worthy for you to ponder about. Thank you for listening. Bye.